August 14, 1482. Edinburgh Castle, Scotland. When the English siege engines finally fell silent after 47 days of bombardment, Captain William Halliburton led his garrison out through the shattered north gate. What they discovered in the camps below stopped them cold. The bodies were there, scores of them, but something was horrifically wrong. The dead had been opened, torn apart, consumed. At first, Halliburton blamed wolves. Then he saw the iron collars scattered among the bones, military-grade restraints, each stamped with the Royal Kennels mark. The siege dogs, over 1,400 pounds of trained English war mastiffs, had been released into no man's land. And when the carnage of battle ceased to feed them, they'd found other sources of meat. The captain's report to King James III contains a single chilling line. The hounds did not discriminate between the tabards of England and Scotland. They fed upon all equally, and appeared to prefer the flesh of those who had trained them. But the truth was far more terrifying than simple starvation could explain. Before we uncover the truth about Edinburgh Castle's war dogs and the massacre that military historians tried to erase from the records, make sure to subscribe to Fear's Sermon and ring that notification bell. We dig into the darkest corners of history that textbooks won't teach you. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Trust me, you'll want to follow this story to its disturbing conclusion. The year 1482 marks one of the bloodiest chapters in the centuries-long conflict between England and Scotland. King Edward IV of England, desperate to secure his northern border and punish Scotland for breaking a fragile peace treaty, had unleashed his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III, to lead a punitive expedition into Scottish territory. This wasn't a war of conquest. This was retribution. Edinburgh itself stood as Scotland's beating heart, a city built on volcanic rock, dominated by a castle that had withstood sieges since the 12th century. The fortress crowned Castle Rock, a 350-foot extinct volcano that made conventional assault nearly impossible. Its walls had been strengthened during the reign of David II, its bastions reinforced with Italian engineering techniques. The English knew they couldn't take it by force. They planned to starve it into submission. But Richard of Gloucester brought something else to this siege, something unprecedented in British military history. He'd requisitioned every war dog from the Royal Kennels at Nottingham, Leicester, and York. These weren't hunting hounds. They were combat animals, bred specifically for warfare. English mastiffs weighing between 160 and 230 pounds each, trained to drag armored knights from their horses and break through infantry formations. Contemporary accounts describe them as beasts of such terrible aspect that grown men would void their bowels at their approach. They'd been used in France during the 100 Years' War, where chronicler Jean Froissart noted they did consume the fallen and struck such terror that entire battalions broke and fled. 73 of these animals arrived with Gloucester's army in July 1482. The siege began conventionally enough. English forces surrounded Edinburgh, cutting supply lines and setting up trebuchets to bombard the walls. Inside the castle, Captain William Halliburton commanded a garrison of 450 men, supplemented by 270 civilians who'd fled the English advance. They had grain stores sufficient for 3 months. They had a water source within the castle walls. They believed they could outlast the English. What they didn't account for was the psychological weapon Gloucester deployed during the 3rd week of siege. At dawn on July 29th, the English released the mastiffs. Not into battle, the dogs weren't meant to assault the castle walls. Instead, they were set loose in no man's land, the 300-yard killing ground between the English siege lines and the Scottish fortifications. Their handlers had starved them for 2 days prior to release. Military records indicate this was standard practice. Hungry war dogs fought more viciously, pursued more relentlessly. But something went wrong. Master of Hounds Edmund Catesby's letters to his brother in Warwickshire, discovered in 1978 in the British Library's archives, reveal a growing unease about the dogs' behavior. They obey not their handlers as formerly, he wrote on August 2nd. When called to kennel, fully half refuse return. They have taken to the rocks and caves beneath the castle crags. We hear them calling to each other in the night, and it is a sound most unnatural. By August 5th, Catesby had lost control entirely. The animals have gone wild. They attack our foraging parties. Yesterday they brought down 3 of our own men who ventured too near their territory. Lord Gloucester insists we recapture them, but I say the devil himself could not bring these beasts to heel. The Scottish garrison watched this deterioration with grim satisfaction. From the castle walls, they could see the English war dogs becoming an increasing problem for their own side. What they couldn't see, what nobody understood until far too late, was that the dogs were organizing. War mastiffs were bred for intelligence as much as aggression. They worked in coordinated packs, communicated through complex vocalizations, and could make tactical decisions in combat. Released from human control, starved and surrounded by the constant stimulus of battle, they'd reverted to something ancient, something primal. They were establishing a hierarchy, claiming territory, hunting as a unified force, and they were learning that humans, particularly wounded or isolated humans, made excellent prey. The first confirmed kill came on August 8th. A Scottish messenger attempting to slip through English lines to reach reinforcements in Leith never arrived. His body was discovered 3 days later by English scouts, or what remained of it. The official report, preserved in the Scottish National Archives, notes evidence of canine predation but attributes it to wolves. But there were no wolves on Castle Rock. The last wolf in the Edinburgh area had been killed in 1453. The English experienced their first casualty on August 11th. A sentry posted on the siege line's southern flank was found at dawn, his throat torn out, defensive wounds on his arms indicating he'd fought desperately against multiple attackers. His sword remained in its scabbard. The assault had come too fast for him to draw it. Lord Gloucester ordered the remaining handlers to recapture the dogs immediately. They managed to secure 11 animals. The other 62 remained at large. Then the real killing began. The pattern emerged slowly, but once you understand what to look for, the historical record becomes chillingly clear. August 12, 1482. 3 English soldiers ventured beyond the siege lines to investigate smoke rising from a copse of trees northeast of the castle. They thought Scottish raiders might be signaling for reinforcements. When they failed to return by nightfall, a search party of 12 men was dispatched. The searchers found all 3 bodies within 50 yards of each other. Thomas Middleton, a clerk embedded with the English army to maintain daily records, wrote, "They had been pulled down from behind, their legs hamstrung, then killed with crushing blows to the skull and neck." The manner of death was consistent with animal attack, yet the bodies had been partially dragged and concealed beneath bracken, suggesting forethought beyond mere bestial instinct. This detail is crucial. Wolves and wild dogs kill and eat immediately. These mastiffs were caching bodies, storing food for later consumption, a behavior associated with higher-order predatory thinking. The Scottish garrison, watching from above, began documenting the attacks in their own logs. Quartermaster James Durham's journal entries provide an unexpected window into the horror unfolding below. On August 13th, he wrote, "The English have ceased their bombardment. We observe unusual activity in their camps. Their sentries stand in groups rather than alone. They have lit fires in a continuous ring around their position, though the weather is warm. They fear something. What they feared was hunting them in the darkness between the siege lines and the castle walls." August 14th brought the incident that would later be known as the Massacre at the North Ravine. A party of 23 English soldiers had been ordered to clear a suspected Scottish sniper position in a rocky gully below the castle's northern face. They marched out at mid-morning, in full daylight, well-armed and armored. 14 never returned. The 9 survivors staggered back to English lines in complete psychological collapse. Several would never speak coherently again. The most detailed testimony came from a man-at-arms named Robert Ashford, whose deposition before military magistrates was preserved in the archives of the College of Arms. "They came from the rocks," Ashford testified, dozens of them moving in concert like soldiers executing a battle plan. The largest, a brindled beast I recognized as Caesar, Lord Pembroke's champion. He led them. They cut us off from retreat, driving us deeper into the ravine where the rocks narrowed. Then they attacked from all sides simultaneously. What makes Ashford's testimony particularly disturbing is his repeated insistence that the dogs were thinking like men. He described tactical coordination, flanking maneuvers, feints, coordinated strikes against specific targets. They knew to attack the officers first, he said. They identified our sergeant by his tabard and brought him down before engaging the rest of us. This was not animal savagery. This was military precision. The bodies recovered from the North Ravine showed another evolution in the pack's behavior. Several victims had been killed by blunt force trauma to the base of the skull, a killing technique the dogs appeared to have refined through practice. More disturbingly, every body showed evidence of organized feeding. The most nutritious organs had been consumed first: liver, heart, kidneys. The dogs were maximizing caloric intake, preserving the remaining meat. They were planning ahead. By August 16th, both the English siege force and the Scottish garrison had recognized they faced a threat neither had anticipated. Lord Gloucester's correspondence with King Edward IV, marked most urgent, survives in the British Library. A single paragraph reveals his growing alarm. The warhounds have become ungovernable, and present a hazard exceeding that of the Scottish garrison. They number above 60, have established themselves in the caves and crevices of Castle Rock, and attack any man who enters their claimed territory regardless of allegiance. I have lost 34 men to these beasts in 4 days. The Scots refuse parley, and I suspect they take grim satisfaction in our predicament. Gloucester was right about Scottish satisfaction, but he was wrong about their refusal to negotiate. On August 17th, something extraordinary happened. Captain Haliburton, commanding the Scottish garrison, sent an emissary under flag of truce to the English lines. The message he carried was unprecedented, a temporary cessation of hostilities for the express purpose of eliminating the wild mastiffs. Both armies would coordinate an organized hunt to destroy the pack before they killed more men on either side. This may be the only recorded instance in medieval warfare where besiegers and besieged agreed to ally against a common enemy. Gloucester accepted immediately. The joint hunt was scheduled for August 20th at dawn. A combined force of 120 men, 60 English, 60 Scottish, would sweep Castle Rock from bottom to top, using nets, spears, and crossbows to eliminate the pack. Military historians would later marvel at the detailed planning involved. The force would divide into 3 groups, each containing soldiers from both armies. They would maintain visual contact at all times. No one would be isolated. No one would become prey. The hunt never happened. On August 19th, the night before the scheduled operation, something attacked the English command tent. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. What happens next defies everything we think we know about animal behavior. Let's discover how this siege became a nightmare for both sides. August 19th, 1482, 2 a.m. Lord Richard of Gloucester maintained his command post in a reinforced pavilion at the center of the English siege lines, surrounded by a full company of guards and lit by watchfires that burned through the night. This was not merely the most secure location in the English camp, it was designed to be impregnable. Sentries stood at 20-yard intervals, torches illuminated every approach. An alarm system of bells and horns could summon 200 soldiers within minutes. The attack lasted less than 3 minutes. The alarm that woke the camp came not from sentries but from Gloucester himself, screaming from inside his tent. When the guards burst through the entrance, they found carnage that would haunt military chronicles for centuries. 7 mastiffs were inside the command tent. 3 were still alive, feeding. Thomas Middleton, the same clerk who documented earlier attacks, arrived within minutes and recorded the scene with clinical precision that betrays his shock. The beasts had entered through the rear wall, having chewed through canvas treated with pitch and lime, a material thought proof against their teeth. Lord Gloucester stood upon his campaign table, wounded but alive, his sword bloodied. 2 hounds lay dead at the table's base. The others fed upon the body of Sir Edmund Catesby, Master of Hounds, who had been sleeping in an antechamber. The symbolism would not have been lost on anyone present. The dogs had killed their former master first. But the truly terrifying revelation came when soldiers examined the rear wall. The mastiffs hadn't randomly clawed through the canvas. They'd targeted a specific seam, one barely visible even in daylight, where 2 sections had been stitched together, a structural weakness no animal should have been able to identify. More disturbing still, the tears in the canvas showed evidence of coordinated effort. Multiple dogs had worked simultaneously to create an opening large enough for the pack to enter. They had reconnoitered the tent, Middleton wrote. They had identified the optimal entry point. They had planned this assault as deliberately as any military commander might plan a raid upon an enemy position. The hunt scheduled for dawn was cancelled. Gloucester, his confidence shattered by the tent attack, refused to send men into the caves and ravines of Castle Rock. Instead, he made a decision that sealed the fate of everyone involved. He ordered the siege lines pulled back 300 yards and prepared to resume bombardment. The war dogs could rule no man's land. The English would reduce Edinburgh Castle to rubble from a distance, and whatever remained, Scottish garrison or mastiff pack, could rot between the armies. For the Scottish defenders watching from above, This English retreat suggested opportunity. Captain Haliburton convened his officers to debate a sortie. With the English disorganized and their siege lines in chaos, a coordinated assault might break through entirely. They could reach Allied forces in Leith, bring back reinforcements, possibly end the siege. The decision to sortie was made on August 21st. 200 men would attack at dawn on August 22nd, striking the English lines at their weakest point while the bulk of the garrison provided covering fire from the walls. At 3 a.m. on August 22nd, the Scottish forces crept down the castle's north face using rope ladders and hidden trails known only to locals. They moved in disciplined silence, weapons muffled, armor wrapped in cloth. Their objective, reach the English lines before dawn and attack with complete surprise. They never made it. The Mastiff pack had claimed the entire 300-yard expanse of no man's land as their territory. They'd been observing both armies for weeks, learning patterns, studying movements. When 200 men suddenly appeared in their domain, moving in vulnerable formation through darkness, the dogs responded with devastating efficiency. The attack came from all sides simultaneously. Survivors would later testify that the dogs had positioned themselves in advance, waiting in ambush positions along the Scottish route. This implies the pack had somehow anticipated the sortie, or at least had prepared for human incursion into their territory from any direction. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Scottish forces, caught in open ground between the castle and the English lines, found themselves surrounded by over 60 mastiffs attacking in coordinated waves. The dogs targeted legs first, hamstringing victims to bring them down, then moved to killing strikes at throats and skulls. Armored men fell and were torn apart before they could rise. Those who clustered in defensive formations found themselves isolated as the pack split and flanked them. Both the English siege force and the Scottish garrison watched helplessly from their respective positions as the massacre unfolded. Torches from both sides illuminated the killing ground. Soldiers on both walls could see everything. James Durham, the Scottish quartermaster, wrote in his journal, "I have witnessed many battles, but nothing prepared me for the horror of watching our men destroyed not by human enemies, but by beasts that fought with more discipline than any army I have seen. They used terrain, they communicated, they adapted their tactics when our men formed shield walls. Captain Haliburton ordered us not to fire upon the dogs for fear of hitting our own soldiers. This was our fatal error. By the time he rescinded that order, there were more dogs than men left alive. The Scottish forces attempted to retreat back to the castle. The pack pursued them to the very base of the walls, bringing down stragglers and isolated men. English archers positioned on their own siege lines finally opened fire, not to aid their Scottish enemies, but to drive the dogs away from ground English forces might need to occupy later. By dawn on August 22nd, 147 Scottish soldiers lay dead or dying in no man's land. Only 53 made it back to the castle, many severely wounded. The Mastiff pack had suffered minimal casualties, perhaps 6 animals killed, a few more wounded. Captain Haliburton's report to King James III, preserved in the Scottish National Records, contains a passage that reveals his psychological breaking point. The animals have proven themselves more formidable than the English army. They hold the ground between us and freedom. We cannot sally forth. We cannot surrender to forces we can no longer reach. We are imprisoned not by England's siege, but by beasts we thought to be mere dogs. For the next 15 days, an eerie stalemate settled over Edinburgh Castle. The English maintained their distant siege lines, occasionally bombarding the walls. The Scottish garrison, now reduced to fewer than 400 effective defenders, watched from above, and between them, the Mastiff pack ruled absolutely, feeding on the bodies that littered the battlefield. The bodies that no one could retrieve. The bodies that, according to multiple observers from both sides, the dogs were systematically stripping of armor, dragging into caves, and storing in organized caches. On September 6, 1482, the siege ended, but not through military action. King James III, facing a political crisis in Edinburgh and unable to break the English siege, negotiated a peace treaty. English forces withdrew. The Scottish garrison was permitted to send out burial parties under terms of truce to recover their dead. What those burial parties discovered would become the most suppressed chapter of the entire siege. The burial parties ventured into no man's land on September 8, 1482, 6 days after the official end of hostilities. They carried shovels, shrouds, and holy water. They expected to find decomposing bodies and scattered bones. the aftermath of a massacre left to rot in late summer heat. What they found instead suggested intelligence that contemporary minds could not comprehend. Father Alistair MacGee, a priest attached to the Scottish garrison who accompanied the burial detail, kept a personal journal that remained in his family's possession until 1923, when it was donated to Edinburgh University. His September 8th entry describes scenes that still disturb modern readers, but the bodies had been organized. I use this word deliberately, for no other suffices. The dogs had separated the dead into distinct groups: English soldiers in one ravine, Scottish soldiers in another, civilians in a third location. Within each group, the bodies had been further arranged by apparent freshness of kill, with the most recent victims cached in shaded areas beneath overhanging rocks, and older bodies left exposed to the elements. His organizational behavior transcends anything attributed to canine intelligence, even among working or war dogs. The mastiffs were practicing resource management. They were preserving food supplies. They were categorizing their kills. More disturbing still, the burial parties discovered that the pack had created what modern zoologists might call a den complex, an interconnected network of caves beneath Castle Rock that served as communal living space. Inside these caves, recovery teams found caches of stripped armor and weapons piled deliberately away from cached remains, gnawed human bones arranged in rough circles, suggesting communal feeding sites, evidence of hierarchical sleeping arrangements, with the largest cave dominated by bone fragments from the largest kills, the remains of at least 37 individuals who had been completely consumed, identified only by scraps of clothing and military insignia. The most haunting discovery came in the deepest cave, the one that required crawling through a narrow entrance that barely admitted a full-grown man. Father MacGee's journal describes it with admirable clarity despite obvious distress. Inside this final chamber, we found the bones of children. 3, perhaps 4 individuals of tender years. They were arranged with care, almost tenderness, upon a bed of stolen cloth. The master of the burial party believes these were civilian children who fled Edinburgh during the first days of siege and hid in the caves, only to be discovered by the pack when the dogs first claimed this territory. The dogs had not consumed these small victims as they did the soldiers, but had collected them, preserved them. I cannot fathom the significance. Modern psychologists and animal behaviorists who've studied Father MacGee's account have proposed several theories. The most compelling suggests that the pack, having lost their role as human working dogs, created a kind of surrogate relationship with the children's remains, treating them not as food but as something to be guarded. This mirrors behavior seen in domestic dogs who adopt and protect small animals or human infants. But the implications that the mastiffs distinguished between categories of humans, reserved different treatments for different types of victims, and demonstrated what might be called sentimental behavior. These remained deeply unsettling. The burial parties worked for 11 days, September 8th through 18th, recovering 223 bodies in total. Not all were complete. Many existed only as scattered bones and shredded clothing. The official death toll from the siege dogs, compiled from both English and Scottish military records, reached 283 confirmed deaths, 164 Scottish soldiers, 97 English soldiers, 18 civilians, and 4 children. But these numbers tell only part of the story. They don't account for missing persons never recovered. They don't include soldiers who survived initial attacks but died later from infected wounds caused by dog bites, a common cause of death in an era before antibiotics. Conservative estimates place the true death toll above 350. More people died to the war dogs than died in actual combat between English and Scottish forces. As for the pack itself, during the burial operations, recovery teams saw the dogs watching from high points on Castle Rock. They counted approximately 55 animals. The mastiffs made no attempt to interfere with body recovery, perhaps recognizing that they still had adequate food supplies cached in their caves, or perhaps understanding that directly confronting large organized groups of armed men would be tactically unsound. On September 20th, Lord Gloucester authorized a final expedition specifically to eliminate the pack. 300 soldiers armed with crossbows, spears, and nets would sweep Castle Rock systematically, killing every dog they encountered. The hunters found the cave complex. They found the caches of bones and armor. They found evidence of the pack's presence everywhere. They found no dogs. The mastiffs had vanished. Contemporary reports from Edinburgh citizens describe sightings of large dogs in the Pentland Hills south of the city throughout autumn 1482. Shepherds reported missing livestock. Travelers claimed they were stalked by unusually large hounds. But no organized effort to track and eliminate the pack ever materialized, perhaps because both the English and Scottish authorities wanted the entire incident forgotten as quickly as possible. The political aftermath proved almost as devastating as the siege itself. King James III faced severe criticism for his handling of the crisis. Captain Haliburton was court-martialed for the failed sortie that led to the August 22nd massacre, though he was eventually acquitted when the court recognized no conventional military commander could have anticipated the threat. Lord Gloucester returned to England with his reputation damaged. He'd lost more men to war dogs than to enemy action, and his superiors never let him forget it. Both governments suppressed detailed accounts of the siege. Official histories mention complications with military animals but provide no specifics. Letters and journals that discuss the mastiff attacks too explicitly often went missing from archives or were destroyed entirely. The political embarrassment of admitting that trained war dogs had turned on their handlers, killed soldiers from both sides, and essentially held siege to both armies simultaneously. This was too humiliating to acknowledge. But the silence that descended over the Edinburgh Castle war dogs achieved something more insidious than mere historical revision. It ensured that the lessons learned would be forgotten, that future military commanders would continue using war dogs without understanding the risks, that the capacity for trained animals to revert to something older and more dangerous would remain unexamined. Over the following decades, isolated reports surfaced of unusually large dogs in the Scottish lowlands. Dogs that hunted in organized packs. Dogs that avoided human contact but occasionally killed livestock or attacked lone travelers. By 1520, these sightings had ceased entirely, whether because the Edinburgh Castle pack died out naturally or because they'd moved beyond populated areas, no one could say with certainty. But veterinary records and kennel logs from the late 15th century show a curious pattern. English mastiff breeding programs were suspended for nearly 20 years after 1482. The royal kennels at Nottingham, Leicester, and York were closed and their animals destroyed. No official explanation was ever provided, but the timing speaks for itself. The military establishment recognized, even if they never publicly admitted, that they'd created something uncontrollable, something that exceeded the boundaries of training and domestication, something that, given the right circumstances, could recognize its own power and use it against the humans who'd thought themselves masters. The Edinburgh Castle war dogs represent more than just a historical curiosity or a grim footnote in the Anglo-Scottish Wars. They expose fundamental questions about domestication, training, and the thin line between controlled violence and absolute chaos. Medieval military forces relied heavily on animals, horses for cavalry and transport, oxen for siege equipment, dogs for combat and intimidation. These animals were tools, investments, weapons. Commanders trained them to channel aggression toward specific targets under specific circumstances. The underlying assumption, rarely questioned, was that this training created permanent behavioral constraints, that a war dog would always obey its handler, that animal instinct could be reliably subordinated to human command. The 1482 siege shattered this assumption completely. Modern animal behaviorists who've studied the Edinburgh Castle incident identify several factors that combine to create the perfect storm of animal rebellion. First, the extended starvation. War dogs were routinely underfed before battle to increase aggression, but the 1482 siege lasted longer than any previous deployment of English mastiffs. The dogs weren't hungry. They were experiencing genuine starvation that activated deep survival instincts. Second, the sustained combat environment. The animals were subjected to continuous sensory assault, explosions from trebuchets, screams of wounded men, the smell of blood and death permeating the air. This created constant psychological stress that eroded trained behaviors. Third, and perhaps most crucially, the concentration of so many war dogs in one location without adequate human supervision. Mastiffs are pack animals. When 73 highly trained combat dogs were placed in proximity, they formed a social hierarchy independent of human control. They began relating to each other rather than to their handlers. And once that pack structure solidified, it overrode their individual training. The Edinburgh case influenced military doctrine in ways that remained unacknowledged for centuries. Historical records show a dramatic decline in the use of war dogs throughout Europe following 1482. By the early 1500s, combat dogs had largely disappeared from Western European armies, replaced by expanded cavalry and pike formations. Official military histories attribute this shift to changing battlefield tactics and improvements in armor. But the timing suggests something else: institutional fear. Military establishments across Europe had watched what happened at Edinburgh Castle. They'd seen trained animals become uncontrollable threats, and they'd quietly decided that the risk outweighed any tactical advantage. This implicit understanding that creating controllable violence might produce uncontrollable chaos should resonate with modern audiences. We've seen it in every context where humans attempt to harness destructive force for specific purposes. Chemical weapons that drift beyond target zones, cyber weapons that escape into the internet, trained insurgent forces that turn on their sponsors. The Edinburgh War Dogs were simply the medieval version of this eternal problem. The incident also raises profound questions about animal cognition that remain relevant today. The mastiffs demonstrated abilities far beyond anything attributed to domestic dogs: strategic planning, organized cooperation, even what might be called cultural transmission as they taught each other refined hunting techniques. This suggests that domestication doesn't eliminate intelligence, it merely channels it. Remove the human framework and the intelligence remains, seeking new outlets. Modern military and police K9 programs emphasize control mechanisms precisely because of incidents like Edinburgh Castle, though few handlers know the historical precedent. Dogs are rotated frequently to prevent over-bonding with each other. They're never deployed in large groups. Their training includes extensive recall exercises designed to ensure they remain responsive to handlers, even under extreme stress. Every protocol exists to prevent what happened in 1482, though the officials implementing these protocols rarely understand why they're necessary. The Edinburgh case also reveals how thoroughly history can be sanitized when truth becomes inconvenient. For nearly 500 years, the war dogs were barely mentioned in siege accounts. When they appeared at all, it was as a curiosity, a brief footnote about feral animals that caused some difficulties. The full scope of what happened: that trained military animals killed more soldiers than enemy combat, that they organized themselves into an effective military force, that they held siege to both armies simultaneously. This remained buried in scattered journals and suppressed letters. Only in the late 20th century, when researchers began systematically examining primary sources from the 1482 siege, did the complete picture emerge. Even now, standard histories of the Anglo-Scottish Wars rarely mention the mastiffs in detail. The story remains too strange, too embarrassing, too difficult to incorporate into conventional military narratives. But perhaps the most disturbing implication is what the Edinburgh War Dogs revealed about human vulnerability. We pride ourselves on intelligence, organization, technology. We've dominated Earth's ecosystem through our ability to cooperate, plan, and create tools. Yet a pack of domestic animals, given the right circumstances, created a territory that professional armies couldn't enter. They killed trained soldiers with impunity. They adapted tactics faster than human commanders could respond. For 2 weeks in August 1482, Castle Rock belonged not to the Scottish garrison that defended it, or the English army that besieged it, but to 60-some dogs that had remembered what their ancestors once were: apex predators who hunted in packs, who learned from experience, who survived by their wits as much as their teeth. That memory still exists in every domestic dog. Domestication is a veneer, training is a set of constraints, but beneath both lies the wolf. The Edinburgh Castle war dogs simply rediscovered that truth under conditions that allowed them to act upon it. The question that haunted military commanders in 1482, and should haunt us today, is this: how many of our other controlled systems are one crisis away from remembering what they were before we tried to tame them? The Edinburgh Castle war dogs vanished into history after 1482, but their legacy remains carved into the blood-stained rock of Castle Rock and buried in archives that authorities tried desperately to suppress. What drove these trained animals to turn so completely against the humans who'd bred, raised, and deployed them? Was it simple starvation, or did something deeper emerge? An understanding of their own power, a rejection of the roles humans had assigned them? We'll never know for certain, but we can examine the evidence they left behind: the organized caches, the strategic ambushes, the apparent decision-making that transcended animal instinct. These dogs didn't just go feral, they evolved. They adapted, They became something their handlers never anticipated. Leave your theories in the comments below. Do you think the mastiffs were simply following survival instincts, or did they demonstrate genuine intelligence and planning? Have you heard of similar cases where trained animals turned on their handlers? What does this tell us about the relationship between humans and the animals we've domesticated? If this story revealed a chapter of history you never learned in school, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon for more dark tales from humanity's past. We dig into the archives that textbooks ignore, uncovering the stories that powerful people tried to bury. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into history's darkest corners. The war dogs of Edinburgh Castle remind us that domestication is not permanent, control is not absolute, and the wildness we thought we'd conquered never truly disappeared. It simply waits for the right moment to emerge. See you in the next video. Until then, remember, history is written by the survivors. And sometimes the survivors weren't human,